Welcome to The Right Stuff, your channel for all things on the writing craft. So, as you've probably figured out by now, getting your start as a writer is going to be a series. I'm not sure yet how long it'll be, but I want to put out as much advice as I can to new writers so that you have the best possible chance at getting your foundational knowledge of what it takes to be an author. Um, in this video, we're diving a little bit deeper. In the previous set of videos, we began at the I think I'll sit down and try to write something level. Today, we're going to the I started writing now. How can I make it work level? We'll be talking about discovering yourself. What does that mean? Well, everyone writes differently. Everyone requires different circumstances to write well, and everyone approaches their work in a different way. And it's up to you to figure out how you operate and what will help you the most as you take this journey. I'm going to go through a few points, but just keep in mind that they're in no particular order. These are just the ones that I wrote down. All right. So first off, think about the environment that you write in, like the actual physical environment. Where do you do your absolute best work that's going to churn out the highest production? Do you concentrate better in a secluded room with the door closed? Or do you need a public setting with some white noise in the background? Does music help? Only if it's instrumental. Wherever you're writing, think about whether it's providing you an environment to concentrate. Keep in mind that some distractions are going to be present, especially if you have family, pets, electronics that are always going off, or that you have to keep nearby. More than likely, it's going to require some obtained skill in blocking out distractions as you write, because unless you're completely alone, they will absolutely sneak up on you. Also, set yourself up a workspace where you're spending most of your time writing, wherever that is. For the most part, keeping a consistent workspace is going to help you focus. If you change it up every single time that you sit down to write, more than likely it's gonna throw you off, and you're not going to be able to keep that consistency. Another thing to think about is the time of day. Oddly enough, a lot of people are more productive during certain times of the day. I'm sure this dives into psychology. That's above my pay grade, so I'm not going to go there. But and of course, this is obviously going to depend on what other responsibilities you might have and what time those responsibilities take place. If you have a day job, you're going to be kind of limited on when you can write. It's more than likely going to have to be after work when you actually have time. Or the weekends if you are busy, every other day during the week. But ask yourself, do you write best before bed? Do you need an hour span of time at the front and back of your writing time where you can just kind of mull things around in your head and kind of digest everything that you've done? Have you have you been thinking about your characters and story while it's your day job, and you just have to get them down on paper as soon as you get home, otherwise you'll lose your inspiration? Discovering what time of day and maybe even which specific days you write best, it's gonna help you immensely. And as soon as you do, try to be consistent with those days. It's the same thing with your workspace. Just try to be consistent with which days that you're actually sitting down to write. Practice is another thing. Practicing your craft. Practice when you practice writing. It's again, this goes into discovering yourself. Some writers will tell you that you need to write at least a little bit every day. While I think that's good advice, it's not always feasible, right? Stuff happens, life happens. And I think I should probably clarify, at least personally, editing doesn't count. I think it needs to be, and I honestly have a hard time following my own advice, but, write something new. Write down words that weren't on the page the previous day. And if you can't write every day, write as often as you can. Start a blog, start a journal, write a script for a YouTube video. The more practice you get, the more comfortable you'll get with writing in general, and the easier it'll get to put those thoughts to paper. Um, and when you practice, you'll start to recognize where your flaws are. This is huge, because it took me when I first sat down to write a book. It took me a long time uh, to really understand where my problems were, and I didn't discover those problems on my own. I discovered them through beta readers, through writing partners, um, and so practicing is going to help. But where you're stuck, you really have to kind of go off and find somebody, find a somebody else. I was trying to articulate that a little better. Find somebody else that is willing to look at your work, so you can get a fresh pair of eyes on it. And this, I'm sure I'll do a video on this later as well, because writing partners are huge. They're a huge help. Um, so, in the vein of recognizing where your flaws are, you'll start to understand your own prose and your own style. So again, one of my flaws when I first started out was that I was often shift between third person omniscient and third person limited POV, point of view, which took me a while to really understand. And I found out that the more I wrote, the more I could catch myself doing it. And I was able to shore up that weakness through time and practice, and to the point where I hardly ever do it anymore. And even if I do, I catch myself. And that is that. For some reason, for me, I don't know if this is hard for anybody else, but grasping the difference between those two POVs was really difficult for me. I just could not wrap my head around it for some reason. I had to have another writer friend basically just beat it into my head until I finally got it. So you'll run into stuff like that. Uh, Next, write what you know. Um, this does take a little bit of discovery, because as you go through life, you don't really like pull things out and say, "Oh, wow, I do this a lot, and so I could really use that to put over here in my writing." Um, you'll hear it a million times in writing circles. Write what you know. Write what you know. Write what you know. What does this mean? Well, when it comes to deciding what you even want to write, you have to figure out what you're familiar with. Write what you've had years of experience in. It doesn't mean like you write a story about an accountant if you do accounting. I mean, you could, but that's not necessarily what this means. For me, I love fantasy. So while I didn't read much growing up, I played a lot of fantasy-based video games because I love swords and magic. I love amazing worlds created by minds that had imagination far beyond my own. I enjoyed seeing what kinds of creatures and monsters and races I could fight or be and what characteristics they had. It was just amazing. So what did I decide to write when I started? Yeah, fantasy. Now I also know retail, so I'm playing around with the idea of a humorous book based on the retail world, but that's more of a side project at the moment. But it's something that I know. So ask yourself what kinds of genres you're familiar with, what kinds of stories interest you. Um, when you've kind of figured that out, then start writing your story. More than likely, if you haven't started writing, um, if you haven't started writing, but you're thinking about it, you already have the story in mind. Just be cognizant of the bedrock that your story came from, and then play into it. Side note: this is one of those rules that a lot of writers will tell you, um, and that is don't write your masterpiece in the first go. Now, I did. My experience was that this rule kind of holds up. It went through so many revisions and story changes because when I first wrote it, I didn't know what in the world I was doing, and I paid for it. So your experience could be different. But let me say this: my suggestion is keep your masterpiece in the back of your mind. Start world building, start coming up with characters, flesh them out, jot down ideas here and there, all while focusing kind of on starter projects, maybe even projects that you don't necessarily plan on publishing. Write a couple of short stories in the same genre that your masterpiece is going to be in, or just write a different novel, just to get the experience of how novels go. Different works have kind of different pieces to them that can be different from other formats. Short stories are going to write differently than novels. Now, if you do go the same route I did, just be ready to put in all the extra work that it takes throughout the life of that first piece. Like I said, I did go back and I had to polish, I had to make it tons better than what it was. So, last thing, this is always a fun one: plotter versus pantser. You will hear this a lot in writing circles as well. Chances are that maybe you've already heard it. What is a plotter and what is a pantser? So if you don't know, the long and short of it is that a plotter, much as the name suggests, is someone who sits down, outlines, and plots out their story from start to finish, then goes in and starts writing the story. A pantser, which comes from the term fly by the seat of your pants, is someone who sits down and just starts writing and sees where the story goes as you're writing it. Realistically, there are very, very few, if any, authors who are absolutely one or the other. Most lie somewhere in the middle, veering toward a particular side. So when you start writing, think about whether events, situations, and characters kind of arise out of seemingly nowhere, and if those things almost seem to lead you rather than you leading them. Or if you have to plan out what's going to happen in order for you to get anywhere with your writing, then that would mean you're a plotter. Sorry. I tend to be a pantser. However, as I've gained more experience, and depending on which book I'm trying to work on, I find that I need to know what my end goal is. I need to know where the characters are heading. Otherwise, I just kind of keep going, or I'll get stuck because I don't know where it's all leading to. So in that aspect, I do plot out a little bit. But for the most part, as I'm writing, I am a total pantser. I just go. Situations just kind of arise as logic would take me, as it makes sense for the characters, and I just go. So it's very interesting hearing somebody on the other side of that describe how they have to get their process down. But yes, terrible pause there. Gosh, I wish I had some editing software so I could cut that out. Someday. Working within this idea of plotter versus pantser and knowing how you best operate, it's gonna make your writing a lot easier and much better. So, as you're starting this process, keep that in the back of your mind and think about which kind of method works best for you and where your best writing comes from. All right. Now, author craft. It is time. So, this is Diana Gabaldon's Outlander, and I just picked a passage from here. If you haven't read Diana Gabaldon, she is a wonderful author, in my opinion. Her writing is very beautiful, very, very fluid, very descriptive. Maybe not everyone would appreciate that like I do, but I certainly do, because she does it in such a way where her description doesn't really take away from the story. It actually adds to it. I've seen some where, they keep describing it, and it's just like, I don't need to know this right now. Like, why are you telling me this? But somehow she does it well. All right, so this again, spoilers if you haven't read the first Outlander book. It could be spoilery. I don't think it is, but here we go. I stared, somewhat taken aback by this unsuspected gift of rhetoric. Start over. I stared, somewhat taken aback by this unsuspected gift for rhetoric. Or perhaps he was capable of such flights of oratory only under the stimulus of crisis. The florid voice thundered on. And so she just, like, it's hard to describe. She has just these words, and they're all like huge words that like any other author would like struggle to use correctly and use in such a way where you weren't confusing the poo out of their readers. Um, but she also kind of like throws a little bit of metaphor in there, and it's just, I don't know, just the way she does it, the florid voice thundered on. It's like any other author could say, um, the pleasant voice continued, and it's like, no, she's got to say the florid voice thundered on, and it's just, I don't know, it's, she just very, very fluid, very, very beautiful writing. um yeah, I mean, that's her whole books. And actually, normally this isn't my type of thing because this is historical fiction, so normally I wouldn't take it and read it, but my wife kind of pushed me to do that, and so I went ahead and read it. For historical fiction, it's actually really good, and I enjoy her writing. So, all right. So just remember, take the time to discover yourself and understand how you best operate as an author. If one thing doesn't work, try something different. See how it works out. Thanks for joining me here on The Right Stuff. I hope you found this informative, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep writing.